button. And we will start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Process Theology class. This is your host tonight, Steve Baska. I am the co-chair of the Pathways Committee at St. Andrew, which organizes the classes. And we are so pleased to have Rev Mark tonight teaching us about process theology in a two-part class with a large group and a wonderful topic. But before we start, want to do a few usual announcements. Please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen. So you'll see a little microphone on there that says mute. If you would click on that so we can keep the background noise quiet. And if we have any folks who have a problem doing that and have background noise, I can do that as a host here also. And Lana Banbury is with us, our church administrator, and she's co-host on here also and has those privileges for this meeting also. Second, we are recording this for future playback, as we do to help with the outreach of the church and replay of our classes. We find that is very popular and helpful. So be aware of your words. This is your public notice. And finally, please be courteous to our speaker and to each other. This is the tradition of our church, and we ask you to do that on classes too. So with that, I want to turn it over to Senior Pastor Mark Feldmeyer, who's been at St. Andrews 6 years and comes from the Claremont School of Theology in California, where process theology was taught, and we look forward to learning about it. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thanks, friends. This is great to see so many of you on the call and to see that you're interested in having deep theological conversations about the nature of God and the forms of God's power and God's love that we experience in our daily lives and in our world. And what I want to encourage you to do is give yourself permission tonight to let go of some of the traditional beliefs that you've had about God. And I'll get into how we can do that and give ourselves permission. But I want to say it up at the outset. There are some Christians in the world who, when they hear concepts of process theology, struggle and find it even for some heretical. It doesn't conform to the traditional theology in so many ways. It certainly doesn't conform with a more evangelical brand of Christianity. And so simply give yourself permission to entertain new thoughts and understanding that that you can't disappoint God with how you believe about God. How's that? That God is God, and it's okay if you have a different understanding of who God actually is. So what I'd like to do, just very briefly, to sort of build our one way for us tonight, is to ask the questions that were sent out earlier today. And if you did receive those and had a chance to just reflect on those briefly, those questions are: when you think of God, what particular attributes do you associate with God? That's the first question. And the second question is, what are some of the paradoxes of the Christian faith that you personally struggle with? Those apparent contradictions between what you're supposed to believe and what you experience about God. So those are the two questions, and I'll leave it open for anyone to make a response. But the first really is, when you think about God, what are some of the attributes of God, the traditional attributes? And if that doesn't make sense, please ask me to clarify. I don't want to give any answers away because one of them might be yours. Anybody want to share? Bob.
I will. Hi, everyone. I wrote down a couple thoughts. I only didn't have a whole lot of time to go over the email, but some of the attributes that immediately come to mind when I think of God are accepting, forgiving, welcoming, and loving.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. That's very helpful.
God is. When he spoke to Moses, he says, I am that I am.
God is.
God is.
We might.
You are.
Mhm. And so theologically, we might frame that in the context of what we would call God's sovereignty. God is sovereign, that God depends on no one else or is defined by nothing other than God. God's sovereignty. That's great.
I would add that God is present in everything, but greater than the sum of everything.
Great. And so traditionally, thank you, David, the understanding there is what theologians have traditionally called omnipresence, that God is everywhere. It's captured in that famous psalm, whither can I go to escape your presence, is the paraphrase, that you're everywhere. God is ever present or omnipresent. So that's a great one. Thank you.
One of the attributes maybe also speaks for me to kind of one of the paradoxes. While I think of God as being all-knowing and compassionate, I think he also has a punitive side to him, which makes me worry a little bit because, you know, he gives us the 10 Commandments, he gives us rules, he tells us when he doesn't like anything. And at the end, I feel like he decides whether or not I go to heaven or hell.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that while he is incredibly compassionate, I also feel a little leery of him just because of this final analysis or this final judgment that he can make on me.
Yeah, wow. Great, a great summation of what I think so many of us feel. On the one hand, God is all loving, I think is what you're saying. The benevolence, omnibenevolence is the theological term. And yet it's balanced with this other concept of God as judge, and that is, or the justice of God is an orthodox understanding of God's nature and action. So how do you balance those two seemingly, or at least at times, contradictory concepts? Yeah, thank you. Others?
Well, I think there's some mental health professionals that teach us that our vision of God is many times our vision of our parents. To some degree, if our parents were judgmental and distant, we see kind of God as judgmental and distant. Or if we have parents were loving and caring, we see God as more closer to us. And I think, so what I think is sometimes authority figures in our lives somehow influence our appreciation of what God is or our attributes we give to God.
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, God is sort of a mosaic of our past experiences, as well as those experiences and beliefs that are handed down to us, sometimes even imposed upon us. Yeah.
God for me is my best friend. There's nothing I could ever do or ever have done that could separate me from his everlasting love. And but he corrects me too. But when he corrects me, it's not in a harsh, condemning way. It's more of a mother of a litter of puppies kind of nudging the puppy back into the center, you know.
Okay.
You know, you're a little off, and usually he'll send either a piece of literature, or oftentimes a friend to me, or a song, whatever, and I'll just kind of like feel like, okay, you're a little bit out of balance there, and and he knows exactly how to say it to where I'll hear it and feel it in my heart and want to be transformed by it.
Yeah, you're touching on some good process already. Some concepts. You mentioned the word nudge, and we'll be talking briefly about how it is that God specifically nudges us according to a process, the theology perspective. Thank you, Don. What? Maybe one more if there's anybody else that wants to share. Ron.
A piece that resonates with me is benevolent mystery.
So two things that I think that are there. One, again, it's this all good God, which has been named, but also the mystery. This idea that God is wholly other. The word is transcendent as opposed to eminent. That God is even beyond our own ability to conceive of, different from us, mystery, ineffable, as we might say, indescribable. So these are wonderful. I'm really interested in what I didn't hear, and that is the traditional notion of God as all powerful. I heard many statements in a variety of ways speak to God's goodness and God's love or compassion, but I didn't hear necessarily that a dominant view is that God is all powerful. Although I assume that for most of us on this call, we have a very clear sense of God's power, or at least we want to believe that God has power to intervene and to even control some circumstances. Process theology really addresses primarily and first and foremost this issue of God's power and how God exercises God's power. So yes, God does have power, but process theology is going to tell us that it's not how we originally conceive of God as being almighty. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to begin a slideshow. There's about 25 slides. And what I want to say, number one, is please, if I need to stop, just let me know. Type it something, use the chat feature. Let me know if you have questions along the way. This process theology is hard to teach to theologians. And so to try to teach it to lay people is a real challenge. What makes it even harder is that we're on Zoom, not in person, which is actually antithetical to process theology, and you'll understand why in a bit. But we're trying to do something here that's really important, and it's going to be really a challenge for us on a number of levels. Both again, personally, we have different ideas of who God is. Process is going to challenge some of that. We have the technology issues and not being in person, all kinds of issues. But I think the biggest one is that we're talking about some big concepts here, and I don't want to lose you along the way. So let me share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. This is the challenge of
There, we see it, Mark.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. So here are some of the fundamental issues that process theology wants to address. If God is all powerful, why does evil seem to go unchecked in the world? If God is all loving, why is there so much suffering? If God created all things, did God also create evil? Does God ever change God's mind? That is to say, can God be affected in some ways? If God already knows the future, what's the point in praying, or frankly, or even being religious? Does God have a plan, like a plan in the true sense of the word, a clear-cut, predetermined future? Do I have a genuine role in determining my future? Does God feel what we feel? These are some of the many issues that process theology helps us address. Now, we just named some of these classical theological claims or doctrines that we have inherited over almost 2,000 years. Christianity existed for almost 150 to 200 years before we began to really formulate doctrine. But since then, we've been trying to understand God, and with that come these claims or doctrines that we inherit and we layer over our experiences in the modern world. So omnibenevolence, that is, God is all good and all loving. We know this statement in Scripture that God is love from 1 John. Omniscience, that God is all knowing, and that historically has meant that God knows everything that has ever happened, that is happening now, and that will ever happen. Also, that God knows ultimate truth from what we might call falsehood, or what some would call that. Omnipotence is this idea that God is all-powerful or almighty, unlimited in power, and able to direct and control things, and to be in complete control of what happens. Omnipresence was lifted up. God is present in all spaces and places of creation. Immutability, this idea that God is changeless, that God cannot be changed or influenced. Some would call this doctrine constancy. God's always the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right? Transcendence, again, this is an idea of God is wholly other than creation. And because of that, God is incorruptible by human nature, especially sin. This idea of eminence, which is the opposite of transcendence, that God is actually in the world. God's involved in the ordinary affairs of the world. This idea of impassibility, that because God doesn't have a physical body, God can't experience what traditionally have been called the passions or the sufferings of humanity. Other, maybe lesser known doctrines, this idea of providence, that God cares for creation in both general ways, that is, ordinary events like the sun rising and the rain falling, caring for creation, but also it's called special providence, that there are times when God intervenes in the ordinary affairs of the world. This doctrine of aseity, that really is this idea that God is self-sufficient, independent of creation, and self-derived, that is, not created by anything else. And then eternality, this idea that God exists beyond time and outside of time, what is part of the traditional concept of the divine watchmaker. God creates time and then sits back and watches it. This was kind of mentioned earlier, this idea of justice. God is just, treats us fairly, judges us according to our actions, and punishes us for our sins. So, process theology in a nutshell. Remember that some nuts are really hard to crack, and process is one of them. But process theology is also known as process relational theology, or another more recent theologian would call it open and relational theology. Is an approach to thinking about the major claims of the Christian faith using a philosophy that's developed by a philosopher by the name of Alfred North Whitehead in the early 20th century. And while much of traditional theology, we just named some of those traditional doctrines, focuses on God's omnipotence and transcendence and eternality and immutability, that is, God's changeless nature. Process theology explores ways of talking about God's call, God's persuasive action in our lives, God's responsiveness to what's going on in the world, and God's love. Process theology envisions a universe that's made out of relationships and that is growing in creative transformation, where God is intimately involved with every creature, and every creature is everlastingly cherished by God, down to the very subatomic particle. God is interested and relating to nature.
Mark, would you like to take a few questions or comments during your slides, or you want to have us hold them till you're done?
I would love to hear any comments or questions if somebody's ready to share.
Joseph, you had your hand up a while earlier. I don't know if you still have something you want to say.
The moment passed. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so feel free anytime along the way to jump in, and we'll take a breather and process together. Let me just share a little bit about how I encountered process theology, because it's important in understanding why I think it's so relevant today, even more relevant today than maybe ever before. I grew up, as many of you know, in the Catholic Church, so all those doctrines I just named were very integral to my own, even as a young child, in catechism and Catholic school, understanding the nature and activity of God in very traditional ways. And then we, in my mid to late teens, we became United Methodists, but still lived in that rather traditional, or what we might call an Orthodox religious experience, pretty square, pretty predictable, and pretty, I think, acceptable to so many people. I was also raised at the time in a fairly rural and mostly theologically conservative community. And then I went to the university and majored in religious studies in college, and was exposed to all kinds of traditional and systematic theologies, as well as the way that religion and theology relate specifically to the events and controversies and questions of our world. So Holocaust, I took several classes in Judaism and was captured by Holocaust studies, and in particular trying to make sense of a God who I understood to be all powerful, who seemingly allowed this terrible evil to take place, suffering. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also classes on medical ethics, questions around right to die and right to live, right to life. These are all relevant to process issues. But really, this idea of what we call theodicy. Why is there evil in the world? Why doesn't God do something about it? And then, of course, in my late teens and early 20s in college, wondering what my purpose in life was. What's my, as we'll talk about in a little while, what's my aim, as process theologians would call it? What's my purpose in life? And so I went to seminary right out of undergraduate school. And for 3 years, I studied full-time at Claremont School of Theology in Los Angeles County. And Claremont has historically always been known as a very progressive, non-traditional seminary, and I chose it for that reason. I really wanted to be challenged. And I was at the tail end of John Cobb's teaching career, who really was the pioneer of process theology. And his protege was David Ray Griffin, who is still teaching in some capacity today, and really studied mostly under David Ray Griffin. And in that process, brought my traditional Orthodox views into conversation with David Ray Griffin in ways that led me to a genuine crisis of faith, when I realized that my answers didn't hold up to some of the questions. And I either had to live with those answers and accept those contradictions, or wrestle with new ways of understanding and relating to God. I went through a season of what we might call deconstruction, where I wasn't really sure what I believed. Here, of all places, in seminary, planning to be a pastor, and talk about scary, and without really a sense of how that was going to play out. But I began to put things together, and came across this Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who was the founder of process philosophy, who described God as the poet of the world, who exercises a tender care that nothing is lost, and who can take what in the temporal world is mere wreckage, as he said, and still bring out of it whatever potential for good that it might have. We're talking about redemption here, right? And how to deal with the aftermath of the Holocaust, the aftermath of Vietnam, and suffering in Los Angeles on Skid Row, and all this human wreckage. What Whitehead was suggesting is that God actually is working in us to change our experience of sin and brokenness and wreckage into the potential for good, and that humans actually have agency in co-determining their future. In other words, it's not all up to God to fix the world. That's a pretty important concept today as we think about climate change, for example, or racial injustices. This is a theology that invites us into action to change the world. So what is theology? Literally, I think it was Anselm, the great theologian, who described theology as really faith-seeking understanding. We begin with faith, in other words, and then we move toward a way to describe it, to understand it. And Christianity is fundamentally different in this way from other religions. A lot of religions begin with a particular philosophy, and then they move toward a way of life and practice. Buddhism is that way. It begins with some very fundamental core principles and then works its way into developing practices that conform to that. Classical Stoicism. Stoicism is huge today. It's becoming a major movement, and it has a real affinity with Christianity. Same way, it's all about basic core principles that lead to change of behavior and practice. But Christianity is different. Christianity is a story, is a religion that begins with a story about a certain person and the teachings of that person named Jesus. And it's a way of life that grows out of that story. And then once we hear that story and we begin to practice it, we start reaching for philosophical terms and theological systems that can ground us in that particular worldview and make sense of what we're experiencing. This is really important because a lot of Christians assume that from day one, that there were these certain doctrines that we had to subscribe to, that Jesus asked us to subscribe to. But those were, the doctrines we just discussed were all the fruit of work that later Christians had done in trying to describe God. So Christian theology is basically nothing more than this sustained, over time, sustained intellectual reflection on the story of Jesus and the way of life that flows from our belief in Jesus. And historically, it has adopted many philosophies to use to create that framework within which the story of Jesus can be told and understood. My point here is that there hasn't just always been one way to understand God or the story of Jesus. So just a brief glimpse of the history of theology, you can see that if you read some of the writings of the Apostle Paul, you can see a lot of references and thoughts coming from the Stoic and Greek world. If you read the Gospel of John, you'll encounter this school of thought called Gnosticism, which runs through much of John. Platonism and Neoplatonism is really what St. Augustine in the 3rd and 4th century depended upon. And you can find that in his book, City of God, and how he contrasts City of God and City of Man. Aristotelianism is very much found in the writings of St. Aquinas in the 13th century. And then after the Enlightenment in the 16th century, mostly you see this movement toward rationalism and Newtonian science, and that really influenced what came to be known as natural theology. That God isn't, by looking at how the world functions according to laws and principles of the natural world. And then if you're a Kierkegaard fan, if you've ever read any of him, he was influenced by a philosophy known as existentialism. So let's just take a pause here and we can ask some questions if you have any so far. Are you all following me? I'm trying to lay a runway here so that you understand that Christians historically have looked to different philosophies in different times and historical contexts to describe who God is, to make sense of God according to the world that we're living in. Any questions? Okay, let's.
I'll throw
Steve?
Question mark if I can. How did we arrive at maybe a general consensus in Christianity that God his story and his doctrines and his will were all set thousands of years ago and told in the Bible, and that it cannot be changed, and that that's really antithetical to process theology, which I understand from the videos you had us watch say that we are in a process continually of changing, and God is co-creator with us, and it was not all set thousands of years ago. How do you think we arrived at that general consensus or understanding that that's how it works?
Yeah, it's a great question. In part, it happens because what we call the patristic fathers, and unfortunately they're all men, got together and tried to make sense of God together and build a theology that would create a sense of unity and agreement around what was true and what was not true. Some of that was meant to help evangelize and proselytize. Some of it was actually used to weaponize the faith and to convert people the hard way. But for 2,000 years, we have been working on making more and more concrete our experiences of God, which is actually a big mistake. There's a whole movement today, not only in process, but I know many of you are huge Richard Rohr fans. Richard Rohr is doing just the opposite. He's cracking it open and allowing us to live in that sense of, as it was described earlier, mystery, and that's very healthy. So various influences, and then certainly some very important historical figures that came up along the way. Anselm early on was one, Aquinas, Augustine, and others that helped to make some of these doctrines more permanent. So what happens in post-Enlightenment, this is really where I think we can begin to understand the distinctions between process theology and all the theology that came before it in the modern world, that is to say, through and after Enlightenment into the world that we're in today. We're probably today we call ourselves more postmodern in many ways, and process theology is a postmodern theology. But process theology is an effort to interpret and understand the Christian story and our Christian beliefs and Christian life and practices in the framework of a metaphysical system that's first worked out by Alfred North Whitehead in the 20s and 30s. By metaphysics, we're not talking about some dreamy, ethereal up in the sky stuff. What we're talking about when we say metaphysical is applying meaning to our understanding of how the world works. And in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment modern world, we adopted this mechanistic worldview. We inherited that from our Enlightenment ancestors. And that worldview basically says that, that the world is made up of material objects. You and me, we are all material objects. And within us are smaller and smaller material objects. Atoms, molecules, cells, all the way down, protons, electrons, neutrons, particles, subatomic particles, right? And the modern mechanistic world said, if you really want to understand how the world works, just pull it apart, like a motor on a car. It's a great way to understand how a car works. Pull it all together and then try to put it back together. And you begin to see how each part relates to the other and depends on the other. And so the mechanistic worldview is isolating and detaching all these different parts of the universe, of people, of objects, to understand them and reduce it to its ultimate meaning. So that reality is understood purely objectively, not according to our own experience of it. That each individual object has its own meaning apart from our subjective experience of it. And that, like an engine, the universe itself is a closed system ultimately, and that it functions according to natural laws. So the supernaturalism that predated the Enlightenment, that you see in Scripture, about miracles, about angels, about heavenly beings, the Enlightenment sort of squeezed all that out, flattened the world, took out the supernaturalism, acts of God, divine intervention. It's not possible. We're in a closed system. God, at best, created the world like that watchmaker and then sits back and watches it function, but doesn't get involved. That was one of the outcomes of the Enlightenment. And that predictability of our future is based solely on the conditions of our past. Excuse me. So our futures are really determined by our past, and our futures are limited by the things that we do in our past. The way Christianity adopted this idea of determinism is this idea of predestination, that all of us, because we're in a closed system, that God's not impacted by our actions, not influenced or affected by us. God already has set a future for us that can't be changed. So that was one example of predestination emerging out of this sort of mechanistic worldview. Take a moment here and just let me get some water, but any questions or insights that you have so far? Is this the world that you understand? Because it's still the world we're living in, a mechanistic worldview.
I just have, I guess, a comment, something that just popped into my mind as I was listening and trying to understand all that I'm seeing on the screen. And then all of a sudden, the thought popped in my mind of the scientists that found the vaccine against the coronavirus. And I think it's, for me, an example of how God works in us and through us. And here we're faced with a worldwide pandemic, and then these human scientists create a vaccine, and the science behind it is just mind-boggling to me. And I think that, to me, it's an example of how God works in us and through us, in those scientists. to
And
basically.
let me add, Judy, I think process theology is actually one of the only theologies I really understand to be able to be in partnership with science. And you'll see why in a bit. But whereas most Christian theologies are at odds with science, process theology would include science as an important conversation partner in understanding God. Insofar as we don't assume that we're dealing with a closed system that can't be impacted by God, which we'll get into in a bit. Any other questions or insights? That's a great one. Thank you, Judy.
Sentence 1, you start talking about process theology. And in sentence 2, you use the pronoun it. Does it refer to process theology?
I'm not really sure what I was referring to in that statement, but I'm assuming yes. I'm assuming so.
Okay. Well, it just, you say that process theology rejects atoms, molecules, and cells, and then you turn around and say that it deals with science.
So let me be clear.
Is that consistent?
It doesn't. It absolutely doesn't reject atoms and cells and molecules, but it describes them not as detached and separate and fixed and independent, but as we'll see in a bit, in fascinating relationship with one another. And just in the last 20 years, astrophysics in particular, we discover that the subatomic level, these particles are actually dancing with each other in relationship with each other. This is kind of what we're going to talk about in a bit. So what I'm saying is that process theology absolutely rejects the mechanistic worldview that says that you can understand the whole by looking at the individual parts, because there are no individual parts. And so an atom isn't an object. What we're going to see in a minute is an atom is an actual, what process theology calls an actual occasion. It's an actual event. You are not understood as a material object. You are a happening. You're an event. Something is going on in you that's in a relationship with other things going on within you and in the world. And so we can't understand ourselves apart from the system.
This description, Pastor, that you described, it almost reminds me a lot of like a quantum theory type of theory where the actual observer is a participant in the creation process in a way. From what I've read about it, it's a little bit over my head, but just since we're talking about atoms and some of the minutia of the building blocks of the universe, it's an interesting theory that I could see the parallel here with, I think, what you're describing, and at least my limited understanding of that process, where you're the observer kind of influences the world in a sense by just observing it.
Right. You're naming it exactly. That. So process theology is going to say there is no objective observer. There's no such thing as that, because we are all experiencing together the subjective relationship and experience in partnership with each other. So and so process people love quantum physics because it's finally giving them the language in the postmodern world that that we haven't had. Great point.
Mark, if I may, at the very bottomest level, at the electron and the quark level, there is nothing. There's really only interaction and only measurement. There is absolutely nothing to be found at the bottom. If there was something there, then there would be something smaller that we could take apart further. And so at the very bottomest level, there's nothing, absolutely nothing.
Yeah, yeah. Precisely. Thank you. That's wonderful. Well, let's move on and then just keep holding your questions, and we'll. These are great questions and insights. I really am energized. Okay, so process theology, and we're going to get into practical stuff in a minute. So we're still, I know, at the 30,000 foot level, but process theology suggests that we have to look at the world as a system of interrelated processes, rather than as a collection of unrelated material or things that are spread out in space. And that existence itself, and to exist, means that we are in relationship. That is the fundamental key to unlocking process thought, that to exist is to be in relationship with other, what are called actual occasions, what we typically would call other objects or people or things. But we're in relationship with other things that are also happenings in the world. So all matter or substances are in relationship with other matter substances, all the way down to the subparticle. And all of existence is deeply relational. So to be in relationship with anything, of course, is really to be affected by that, but also to have an effect on that, right? So a relationship is both giving and receiving, so that when we're in relationship with anybody, we're having the simultaneous effect and being affected. So there's nothing in existence that is not in relationship, and that includes God. If God exists, if we affirm that God exists, then we have to say that God is in a relationship with everything, every created thing. So here's the question: how and where and when did this relationship between God and the creature, or creation itself, begin? So there's this idea that's been around for centuries. In the Latin, it's creatio ex nihilo. That means literally creation out of nothing. And this is a fundamental doctrine that is a part of our Christian tradition since about the 2nd century. And this idea that before the act of creation itself, there was only God, no matter. And frankly, there's no biblical basis for this idea. In fact, if you open your Bibles and you read just the first 4 sentences of Scripture, this is what you find. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So a few things here, right? Number one, something existed that God worked with. It wasn't nothingness. There was something there. It was formless. It was chaos. That it was disordered chaos, disordered creation, and this other idea that God speaks creation into existence. Let there be light, and there was light. There's influence that God has in the creative act. But 2 things: God didn't begin with nothing, and God didn't force anything to happen. God persuaded the soupy chaos to do something, to begin actualizing, so to speak. So the actual account in Scripture is that God created out of chaos, not out of nothing. And this chaos was not created by God. And so the assumption is that the chaos was not altogether perfect. So now we're beginning to understand if the creation and that original chaos was not perfect, it actually contains the material and power to go against God's will or God's call. In other words, God doesn't have absolute control over it because God didn't create it. This is process theology's way of describing how it's possible for evil to exist in the world. If that there was no God before creation, that this is the chaos and God coexisted simultaneously. So traditional theology and Christianity, as well as Judaism and Islam, says that God created the world and then God has power over it. So this raises again the question of why there is evil in the world. And historically, Christianity and the church has given the traditional answer, which is, well, the only answer there we have as to why there's evil in the world is to say you have to have faith and trust that God has a plan, and that everything, even evil, might play a role in that plan in order for us to be a part of and for God to achieve God's ultimate purposes in the world. So from this one doctrine of creatio ex machina, or creatio ex nihilo, from this one doctrine, we get all these subsequent doctrines about omnipotence, that is God's all-powerfulness, divine intervention, God's transcendence, that is aseity, outside of time and space, God's changelessness, God's eternality, God's independence from all of creation. All of these doctrines come from this one idea that God created the world out of nothing. And historically, traditionally, biblically, it's not true. Happy to take another break for questions. I'm throwing a lot at you, but I hope I'm bringing you along. And if I'm not, please just feel free to jump in. Any questions?
My first thought is, where did God come from? Can you answer that question?
Thank you.
Process theology doesn't answer that question. It doesn't have a sense of a beginning of time. It only knows what, from scriptural perspective, it only knows to begin there.
So Mark, is that the same answer regarding the chaos as well? That it doesn't have an answer for where the chaos came from?
Right. That's it. It just existed.
So if I'm following you so far, just to recap a little bit, this is a constant ongoing, this is no longer a monologue. God is in relationship. God's not static. God is changing in each moment. Is God vulnerable now?
Yeah. God is, and we'll see in a second, God, there's what we call a responsive nature in God, a creative nature of God, a responsive nature of God, and a consequent nature of God, which is to say our actions impact or have an effect on God. Because again, to be in a relationship is to be affected and to have an effect. And so if God dares to have a relationship with creation and us, God can be impacted, hurt. So God becomes vulnerable, takes a great risk, hoping that we'll do the right thing. Great question.
So if all of those things are true about God and God's vulnerability, and here comes the remedial question: if God's all powerful, can he make a rock that he can't pick up? Is God vulnerable to the point of not existing any longer? Do I need to be on the lookout for a backup deity in my life, just in case things don't work out well?
Yeah, great question. Insofar as God is not matter, that God is understood only relationally, I think the assumption would be that God does live eternally, but that God lives eternally in time and space, so that that God is changing with us, and working with us, as we'll see in a second, toward what process theology calls an initial aim, an ideal quality of life that's described in various ways: beauty, peace, wholeness. That God's actually on that same journey with us.
So you just described God in a way where God, this is, I think, the first time that you are suggesting that God's eternal. I'm not eternal. I'm finite. So there is this relationship. Well, I'm gonna go with eternal's better than being finite, and saying that God's still bigger than me in this conversation.
Yeah.
I guess my question would be here, where does this fall into this theology you're talking about here? Is what are our human capabilities to understand God, and where are our limits? I guess where I go from there is, if you walked up to a couple of toddlers in the sandbox and tried to teach them calculus, they're simply not capable of understanding. So that's my kind of wondering here, where do our human capabilities of understanding fall in here in this whole discussion?
And I think process theology would respond by saying we're limited only to our experiences of God. And you'll see how this plays out in a second. But and those experiences continue to evolve and get more, as process calls it, novel. I'll get into that as well in just a bit. But that because God isn't a thing to be understood, but a relationship to be experienced, we're limited to that experience of God in itself. So on the left here, you'll see this traditional understanding of God, that God is outside the universe, working God's power onto the universe. And we would typically understand that to be a more forceful, or what we might call coercive action. God makes the universe do things because God's outside of it. But in this process understanding, all things exist in God and in relationship to God. The universe itself is held within the larger experience and relationship of God. So here's some really important key core principles, and this is where I think it will begin to start making sense. Number one, God's power is expressed persuasively rather than coercively. God doesn't impose things on the universe, as you saw in that diagram before, or force creatures to do things or live in a certain way. God's power, on the opposite, really here is to call the universe into being. Just as God speaks to the creation and says, "Let there be light," God calls the chaos toward order, more and more order. And as God summons creatures to act and to live in ways that are hopefully going to fulfill God's will and purpose in the world. Marjorie Suhaki is another scholar who recently retired from Claremont. She put it this way: God works with the world as it is to call the world to become what it can be. And so our job as creatures is to cooperate with God for God's will to be done, at least in the short term. And this means that creatures put real limits on what God can do in the world. And it means that God is not understood as omnipotent, at least in the traditional sense of the world, of the word. So think about it this way: there's a children's fable about a rivalry between the wind and the sun. And the question is, which one would be able to move or remove the coat of that man down the road? And the wind says that it could, and so it blows and blows and blows with great force. Unfortunately, the strength of the wind was such that the man just drew his coat more firmly around himself. It was a more coercive act. Just raised down on the man until finally he grew so warm that he removed his coat. In process terms, the wind works coercively, trying to force its will upon the man, but the sun works persuasively, luring the man's cooperative action. So to be able to elicit the willing cooperation of another we understand that to be a far greater power than simply trying to force the other to do as one wishes. I hope, I hope we know this to be true in our real human relationships. As parents, if you're a parent of children or grandchildren, you can force them to do something and they won't want to do it. But if you can elicit in them a willing cooperation and lure them to do what is right, the chances of success are greater. So if you just look at some of the scripture passages that would support this, these are major formative stories in scripture. God calls Jonah the prophet to go to Nineveh to preach repentance, and Jonah actually turns around and runs in the other direction as fast as he could. Now you could argue that there was a big fish that swallowed up, Jonah. Whether that was God's doing or not depends how you read that story. But God gives Jonah the freedom to do what Jonah wants to do. God calls Abraham and Sarai to leave everything behind and go wherever God would lead them. They just didn't wake up one morning and find themselves in Canaan. God didn't just pick them up and drop them there as if they had no agency in the process. God calls Mary to bear a son named Jesus, and Mary could have said no. In scripture, God is constantly committing divine purposes to human agency, luring human agents to respond. God's power is a power of calling or wooing, luring or persuading creatures toward the enactment of divine ideals, not using a power to impose divine will on sort of hapless characters. Take a moment and entertain some questions. How does this stack up with you?
When you talk about the creatures, God creating the creatures, and isn't it mainly humans that don't cooperate?
Yeah, I mean, and this is where it gets complicated, and I'll get into this in a bit, but with higher forms of life, and I don't know if process would use that language, but more sentient beings have the capacity for greater good as well as for greater evil. And so think about, I had this later in the slide, but it answers a question. So we have a greater capacity for doing good than maybe our dogs do. But our dogs also have greater capacity than the fleas on their backs do for doing good, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but it does recognize that there are different, as we call them, not objects, but occasions, or actual occasions that have greater capacity.
My comment isn't so much a question as it is an observation. Ross and I were raised Lutheran, and the definition of God was much more Trinity based. And then that evolved into from Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to, in the last decade, we've attended more progressive Methodist church in Tucson, and they've moved beyond God is bigger than all of that and bigger than male or female, and or the Spirit was defined as feminine. And so as we're learning more about process theology, what it came to be described as makes much more sense in context of this, in that if it is a three-part whole, that if we think of God and the relationship with us, it's more like the lover, the beloved, and the love that flows between, that connects all of us. So we're interested in this expanding of understanding. So thanks very much for bringing this to us.
Yeah, and I'm going to write this down. So next week, now we're laying down some just basic principles. Next week we'll talk about some of these more practical things, like how do we understand the Trinity? Actually, how do we understand who Jesus was? And what about resurrection? What about virgin birth? What about prayer? What's the function of prayer? So these are all leading, these conversations today are leading to more, I think, engaging conversations about how we actually live this stuff out. So we're going to continue on these core principles, and this next one. So again, the first one is God's power is expressed persuasively rather than coercively. It's a key principle. God doesn't force or impose God's will upon us. The second is that God's power is expressed in responsive love. So again, process is going to argue that we don't understand the world in terms of substances or matter. You are not a substance. You're not pure matter. You are a society, literally, of a whole lot of relationships going on within you. And process calls these actual occasions or moments or experiences of events. This is like you've got to shift your whole understanding of the world. Nothing is static, nothing is fixed, but everything is in relationship. So the world is made out of events and happenings, moments of feeling, which are internally related to each other in patterns, and then patterns of patterns. So again, in a human being, there are patterns within patterns of relationship, as well as in the world. The basic unit of reality then is not matter, or it's not the atom. The universe is made of moments of experience or moments of feeling. And this is in direct contrast to that modern worldview, the mechanistic worldview, that says it's all basically material that's devoid of feelings. Again, the subjectivity is flattened out of the modern worldview of reality. And this is where it gets a little fun. So how does this actually work? Okay, every actual occasion, that is you, for example, begins with two things. One, the first is an initial aim, as process calls it. And the second is an inflowing of data from the past, an inflowing of outcomes and consequences of your past. So God provides the initial aim that begins every actual occasion on its process of becoming. Right now, you have an initial aim, and that is both God's sort of ideal aim for your life overall, but that initial aim then is changed in every moment of your life based on everything you've done in the past, including just a second ago. And from this, so God knows then in every moment, every possibility for everything that could happen in the future, based on where you are today, where you are in this very moment. God's omniscience is defined as being able to know everything that's happened in the past and everything that could happen in the future. But your future is not determined already. God doesn't know how it's going to end. All God can do is put before you this range of possibilities, and then give you the chance to respond to one of those possibilities. And in that response that you make, that affects God's next creation of new possibilities in the next moment. So everything is dynamic, it's not static. And I'll give you a diagram in a second here. God then gives the emerging moment a feeling of its own best possibility. God experiences with you the decision you make, for example, and in that moment says, in essence, you could do any number of these things, but if you want to become this, this is the best possibility for you. So God is constantly calling all occasions, that is you, into becoming more and more the best of who you are called to be in your initial aim. God does not force anything into being or dictate what anything becomes. So in this relationship, you're moving, you're acting. God is responding to that, feeling it first, then responding based on where you are and what you've done, and creating multiple possibilities in the next occasion or the next moment. God receives each complete occasion into himself. We call that consequential love. God's affected by what you do. And on the basis of that occasion, together with God's eternal knowledge of all the possibilities that are out there, offers to you the next possibility for you to fulfill your aim. So it's this constant, as it was said earlier, this constant dialogue in the world. Let me I think about it. Yeah, and I apologize, I didn't have time to finish this, but say for example, this is you. This is you. You're the actual occasion here. And I just put 3 possibilities, but there's an infinite number of possibilities surrounding you in this moment. And you're moving this way, maybe not so linearly, maybe it's more cyclical in your life. But in each moment, you have an infinite number of possibilities. So say you choose this possibility. And then this is your new actuality, your new occasion. This is your new experience in the world. And then you're given a number of new possibilities, an infinite number, and you choose this one. And maybe it's not the best one. Maybe this would have been the best one to get you closer. Your initial aim was down here on the right, but you choose this one. But doesn't mean it's over. Maybe you make a mistake, a bad decision. But even in that moment, you're given more possibilities to make a better choice. And so you choose this one, and now you're back on your path. So each of these moments you'll see, you might think of a lure that God is luring you along, and you choose this one instead of this one, and that puts you up here. But then you've got more chances to get closer and closer to your initial aim. It's not a perfect diagram, and I just didn't have the time to. If I had a whiteboard, we could really map this thing out in fun ways. But the idea is that that there's this constant conversation, dialogue with God about what's right in the next moment. So process says that your past plays a role in your present, but that your future is always open. It's not predetermined. There's no determinism here. There's no predestination. When we ask the question, does God have a plan for you? Process would say no. Process would say God has an aim for you. It's an initial aim, and God is constantly calling you toward that aim, but you have the freedom to go there or not. We create in the present moment by taking certain aspects of our past. It's called prehension in process thought. You grab those experiences from your past and make up your present. And we're limited in our present moment by our past events and our decisions. But in every moment, we have the freedom to create a better future for ourselves. God's power is this understood in terms of the creative, responsive love. You're not going to hear process theologians describe omnipotence. The preference is to highlight God's love as power rather than God's coercive nature. So offering this infinite number of possibilities to us in every moment for what process calls greater novelty in fulfillment of our initial aim. I'll get into this in a second. This means that we are co-creating again with God in every moment, out of our past, and we're never really acting independently from our past or God's lure or persuasion. So all matter has the freedom to self-determine its present and future. God can't determine how it will go. God just works to persuade us to choose the best possibility in front of us in any given moment. So that what happens in the world is a byproduct of an actual occasion's self-determination and God's persuasion and response. So we'll, again, take a pause and invite some comments.
I've got one, Mark, if I could. So does process say that God ever intervenes to stop people from making a bad decision? Say somebody's got their finger on the nuclear button, and does God ever step in and save the world?
Yeah, and this is where it gets hard for some Christians to pursue process theology, because process says no. That's not in God's nature. So if we understand God as love, and we understand the purest forms and nature of love itself, love will never act coercively to do for the other what's the responsibility of the other, but also the privilege of living. So your freedom is to choose is of greater value than any outside force determining what's best for you, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That does not stop God from persuading the button pusher in that moment.
Right.
So God's presence is still there. We're discussing it in a different way, I think, and I understand the language.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. I think you're exactly right. And maybe God is working overtime in those moments to create as many micro possibilities to get you to come around, right? But at the end of the day, it's your decision.
Yeah. Is the initial aim a concept just for the individual, or is it something that God has an ultimate aim in mind for creation, and then each component is just going through some random probabilities to that end goal? Or is it more that each of us has an initial aim applies to us individually?
And so it applies all the way and throughout all of creation, both on an individual level, but also on what process calls a societal level. And by society, it means, of course, how we understand society today, but that there are societies of actual occasions both within us. I mean, this living body itself is a society of living occasions, all kinds of relationships going on within me. And I relate to my family, and that's a society, and that family relates to my neighborhood and my community and my church and my world and the ecosystem in which I live, right? All of creation. So it's both, that there's an initial aim for all of creation, and that our initial aim ultimately should be in pursuit of that larger initial aim too, or at least in not in conflict with it, but in cooperation with it.
This makes so much sense. From my personal experience of God, this is so much more consistent with how I experience God than so many things I've heard in the past. This is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I agree with Jennifer on that one, because it's the way I've seen it. And maybe it's because I've had a lot of choices in life. Comes from the length of the life, but also comes from just the way we did.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of choices, and I it's been wonderful. So to me, it's this is easy, Jennifer, to understand, and I understand why you do.
Yeah, and Judy, I think to your point, none of those choices that are in front of us can be understood as right or wrong.
They just are.
They're different, and they lead to different outcomes that then God responds to those to try to pull us back to our initial aim. So an example is, and I preach this a lot with, especially when I do counseling with folks. I mean, I can describe back in 2014, all this time in 2014, I got a call out of the blue when I was in a meeting in San Diego at my church there from a superintendent who said, "Hey, we have this church in the Denver area. Are you interested?" Right? And I had to sort of process this idea of like, what's my purpose? What's my aim? Where is God calling me to greater and greater novelty, as I show on the screen? And we'll talk about that in a second. But I had to come to the conclusion that this isn't a choice between right and wrong. There's not a bad decision and a good decision. There's just multiple decisions. And each of those leads to something greater. And maybe it sets me back, but it doesn't determine the total outcome of my future. And I think we can all relate to that. I tell people all the time, hey, should I do this or that? Well, neither one is necessarily a bad decision. They just lead to different outcomes, at least temporarily. And
A time check here for Mark. It's 7:55 in case you want to stop at 8 o'clock, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Let me just finish up the last slide or two.
I have one comment. I don't know if you noticed this when you were building your diagram, but to me, it looked very much like a flow chart. Where I don't know if in computer programming classes that I've had in the past, that's the way a flow chart for a computer program is created, that if you reach a decision, and if it's yes, you go one way. If it's no, you go another way. And then at some point, it either works or it doesn't. And I guess at that point, if it doesn't work, you start over or take another path.
Yeah.
But it looked very much like a flow chart.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that's helpful. It's like an if-then. And that's what I want to suggest, is that that's God's posture.
Mm-hmm.
It's an if-then. If you do this, then I'm going to create possibilities for you in that moment to correct or to continue on that trajectory you're on. But God's activity is being affected, number one, by what you do. God feels it, and because God feels it, God can act in ways that are creating new possibilities that are out of love, right, for you. And so we have talked about this initial aim, and I can talk more about it next week too, but essentially the way process describes your initial aim is it's not really in any way contradictory to what traditional theology would describe. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, would describe your initial aim as perfection. That is to say, we are perfected by grace over time, and the end point is that we will experience the wholeness of God, the fullness of God. There'll be no gaps. Well, process, I think this is why process theology and Methodism actually have a great history relationship. John Cobb is 94 years old, living in California still, and he's a United Methodist. And so this idea to become the best we can is like at the sort of the minimal level of what our initial aim is. God wants us to be the best that we can be. God lures us to higher and higher forms of value and experience. And that's described in process as novelty. We have more, as I said before, we have more powers and possibilities than other less sentient beings, but it doesn't mean we're more important. We're just, we can become more than our dogs can, and our dogs can become more than our fleas can. But process describes this contrast between triviality versus novelty. So if you go back to that diagram, maybe you make a not so good choice that sends you on a different trajectory. Process calls that a trivial choice. That is to say, choosing possibilities that are less than ideal. Trivial literally means less than ideal. But a novel choice is choosing a possibility in every given moment that leads to what process calls maximum intensity. That is to say, the fullness of the experience of being human, being alive, being in a relationship with God and others, and maximum harmony. So that the fullness of being alive and the fullness of being well, being at peace, being whole. And that's just not only for itself, for oneself, but for society as a whole. And a lot of process would call that experience one of beauty. So novelty leads to beauty. So if the nut still hasn't been cracked for you, let's remember a few key concepts here. Reality is not made up of matter, but of moments and experiences, events, all on their way toward or in process of pursuing their initial aims. God is involved in the world in the most intimate way, but is not reduced to the world. The emphasis on change and relationship rather than isolated, unchanging substances, I think fits well with the Bible's picture of a dynamic creation that is moving toward a historical destination, a purpose. So there are three powers. There's the power of the past, and process theology says our past matters, and our past determines in large part where we are today. It doesn't determine our futures, but it speaks to who we have become today. And we take those creative influences of the past into ourselves in every moment. Then there's this other idea, the other power, that's the creative power of God. It's offered at every moment. God offers us a future, a good future, a way of becoming oneself that's not like any other way we've ever achieved in our past, because we are becoming. God's creativity is the power of transformation, of hope, of a new future. And God's influence toward the future takes account of the past that affects us and offers a way of dealing with that past. Again, go back to that quote from Whitehead, dealing with the wreckage of life and doing something with it. And then there's the power of ourselves. So you're going to hear these principles in my preaching now a lot. In fact, this third one I preached on Sunday, yesterday. In my third point in my sermon, that a scrivener helps us take responsibility for our lives. We have the power within ourselves to decide what we become. We are responsible for dealing with the actual past that we've received from the world and the possible future that we receive from God. So we're in between these two powers, exercising our agency. The world as we know it in every moment, the end result of the creative process is the power of the past, which is the power of the world, the power of the future, which is the power of God, and the power of the present, which is our own power. And our freedom is to take these three creative powers, to use them, to choose. The choice of how we use them is completely ours. So that gets us to 8, but I'm more at 8:03, but I'm more than happy to just take a pause here. Let me figure out how to stop sharing. Good.
I have something to note, Mark. I mean, Reverend Mark, I think that, maybe some people will look at this as kind of a hippie progressive way of thinking about God, but to me, it doesn't seem like it's really very much in opposition to so many of the traditional ways of viewing God. If you think about, human history, societies were built on authority, and people didn't have the ability to have unlimited choice and to interact with every type of person, and there was no ability to think about nature on the other side of the world. So it was like I don't know, it seems like now that we have democracy and kind of the skills for interacting with one another and thinking of universal human rights and equality among every human being and understanding more about nature, it seems like this is actually a way of knowing God that builds on the traditional rather than kind of gets rid of the traditional understanding.
Absolutely. And so not only does it do that for us in terms of helping us understand God, but I think what the gift that it gives us is that it allows us to see the world differently. So if we're going to really solve or work on what for many of us is an urgent issue, the climate crisis, we have to get outside of the mechanistic worldview that says that all these different parts are separate and unrelated. And I mean, think about how we talk about creation or even our own communities as though we're not part of the ecosystem, right? It's a thing out there, rather than a thing that we're relating to every second, every nanosecond of our lives. And that changes the way then we understand it and how we relate to it. And so it has both, I think, the power to connect us more deeply at a spiritual level by seeing that actually everything's spiritual. Everything is spiritual, but it calls us into action in ways that can actually save ourselves.
Mark, or Jackie, actually, some of these things we say that seems like some people might think it's something, new hippy dippy kind of way of thinking, whatever. I was raised in Southern California, about 20, 30 miles from the Claremont School of Theology. And so this is all very familiar to me. I don't know that I've heard it expressed as process theology, but because I was right there, the clergy that I was exposed to had either graduated from Claremont or had done continuing studies there. So I think it probably permeated a lot of the Southern California, which Mark, I'm sure, is very aware of. And to Ron Davis's comment earlier, that our vision of God oftentimes correlates to a vision of one's own parents, I would include clergy in that. And our religious leaders through the years, my Sunday school teachers, my youth group leaders. I was, born and raised in Methodist and then United Methodist Church. So some of this, while it didn't have that title of process theology, a lot of that understanding, I think, was there. When you asked earlier about the attributes came to mind of God, mine were powerful, creative, supportive, and caring. So I think I clearly had some influence along the way to this type of theology and theological thinking.
Yeah. Thank you, Donna. It's great.
Well, I think I hear a lot of, especially in your recap there, you use the word responsibility. And I think why I like what you're telling here is it's about personal responsibility. I've got a good friend who's a retired Presbyterian minister, and he talks a lot about Calvinist theology, and that Calvinist is his philosophy of total deprivation, where everybody's just rotten to the core and only Christ can save them, but only God chooses to allow certain people to be saved. And that's their whole predestination thing. To me, that takes completely away the personal responsibility of choice. You can always say, well, I'm bad because God didn't choose me to be the right kind of person. So I like this whole thing that it's really about personal responsibility as we move through our lives.
Yeah. And relationship, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's definitely a theology that makes sense today. You know, you talked earlier about Aquinas and St. Augustine. You know, and somebody mentioned that a minute ago, that made sense back then. And it kind of puts us on a higher level than we used to be in our relationship with God and how we go about things. So some people may say, whoa, time out. This doesn't work because, God's up here and he's the one. And this kind of puts us, a little closer to having some control over that. And you talk about theologies, like yourself, I was raised Catholic and Jesuit high school and part Jesuit college. And this is not a lot different than what the Jesuits would say. I mean, it's like you determine what you're doing and you believe, and it's very similar.
Yep, absolutely.
That last comment made me laugh. Similar background and heritage, recovering Catholic here, admittedly. The thing that I heard throughout the course of the evening was the more I was able to wrap my brain around it, and I did have moments where I did understand you, thank you, that it created the space for greater intimacy with God. And that became apparent to me, that I could be much closer, much more approximate with this. So that was kind of a neat thing. Thanks.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And that's what I mentioned, when I was 22 years old, and my first year of seminary, and sitting across the desk with like one-on-one with David Ray Griffin, and being challenged and seeing my faith begin to get deconstructed in ways that were scary and also liberating. And what that did is it took the conversation about faith out of this intellectual belief about principles and doctrines, and put it into a relational level that actually really fostered a greater sense of intimacy with God. Like God is truly ever present and ever before me. Yeah. And I can screw up, and I know that God is going to create more possibilities for me for redemption, to redeem the wreckage that I've created.
So if maybe you'll deal with this next week, but why did the priests of perhaps, I think, Central America or Southern America get in such trouble for preaching this process theology to the natives and the indigenous people? What was the trouble that they got into for that?
Liberation theology.
Well, I think a big aspect there is personal agency. That if each of us has the agency and freedom to at least co-create with God, maybe we actually don't need the kind of church that the church has tried to be for us, which is to be the intermediary. And I'm not saying Methodism is that, but certainly there are forms of Christianity, including Catholicism, that try to run the interference on that. And back to Joseph's point, this idea of the intimacy of God, we have greater access. That's one thought.
And so next week, I hope you talk about the impact of prayer.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of people pray for one another, and especially as if we could intervene on health crises or situations where does that work? What's the
Yeah.
And where does Jesus fit in the process theology in all of this? Because Jesus is not mentioned in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's what theology calls Christology, and there is a Christology that is a theological understanding of who Jesus is that I think is very liberative and helpful. So next week we're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the value of prayer, and we're talking about a little bit more about what we called earlier theodicy, evil in the world, and again, the nature of evil. There are different kinds and forms of evil that process describes that I think are helpful as we try to discern what's truly evil and what is more like consequential evil. So, for example, what Adolf Hitler did was genuine evil, right? But if I drive down the road and I run over a bunny rabbit, that's not the same sort of level of evil, but that is understood by process theologians as an aspect of evil, insofar as that's not the initial aim of creation. So I think some real practical ways to apply process theology. And what I will say is, what I've learned to do is it's more integration than it is throwing out the old stuff and adopting this new model. What I'm doing, I'm in the second half of my life. What I'm trying to learn is how to integrate this in my own practice in ways that are life-giving for me and for others. And it begins with understanding that we don't live in this object-oriented world. We live in this I, thou, as Buber called it, the great philosopher, this I, thou relationship that is influencing each other, impacted by each other. So I want to leave the mechanistic, deterministic world behind and live in this relationship. So I know I've kept you too long, and we could just keep talking because it's fun stuff. But thank you for your great engagement and your questions. I am more than happy to. Steve, you've recorded this, so you can see this once it's posted, and more than happy to talk more with anybody. Think about it for the next 6 days. Come back in 7 next Monday and ask your questions. If you want to email me ahead of time, do that so I can be prepared. I'm not an expert. I'm a practitioner, and maybe one of these days I'll get. I've got a couple of good theologians and scholars in process that we can get on this call and have good conversations. So blessings on every one of you today. It's good to be in process and in relationship with each of you and all of you together. I'm grateful for you. So have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark and Steve.
Awesome.
Thank you. See you next week.